Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 157 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, is there anti-bald discrimination?
Um, probably a little.
Have you experienced it in your life?
Other than in like a joking way, no.
Are the jokes funny?
Hit or miss.
Okay. Does it depend on who's telling the joke? Like, if one
Oh, for
bald
sure.
person says another joke to you, like, is that funnier than if I, with a full head of hair, made a joke?
I really think it depends.
Do you have any good bald jokes, like, ready to go?
Not off the top of my head. Didn't.
I was going to say there's not much on the top of your head.
But there's this one video that Liz sent me on Instagram, just like an Instagram reel.
Yeah.
You know how if you get like a cat, like a kitten spayed, they like shave part of its stomach.
Yeah.
There was a video of like a guy who, just got his kitten spayed, and it was, just like you didn't see the guy at all, but he was just making fun of the cat for being bald. And then after a couple seconds, it starts to turn like a little aggressive. And
The
then
cat gets aggressive?
no, him making fun of the cat starts to get a little aggressive.
Oh.
And he's like, "You're bald. Everyone hates you for it." And when he starts saying that, the camera flips and it's him and he's bald. And it's a lot of like self hatred
Yes.
for being bald. So self-deprecating humor about being bald, I think, is always very fun.
I'm all for that kind of stuff. Gavin, always very self-aware for all the listeners out there. And it's good to be back. We're missing
Yeah,
Fia this week, but Gavin and I are going to keep the podcast train right on the tracks.
absolutely. And with that, this may or may not be a kind of long one, so we'll get into our sort of opening segments here. So since Fia's not here, we don't have a oh my we don't have a Seagrass corner, so I will do some housekeeping. Mike will do a Today in History, and then we'll get rolling into the main topic of the show. So do not forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in order to give us feedback about the show and suggest any future topics you'd like to hear us talk about here on the show. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, make sure to fill out our guest form, and you can find that down in the show notes. Next episode, you can probably tell this by the title of this episode. This is not what I had planned to talk about initially. This episode was supposed to be about isopods, which are a neat little group of crustaceans, like roly-poly or pill bugs or potato bugs, different places called them different things. That was going to be this episode. That's actually going to be next episode, because we're talking about sort of a current events thing today. While it's topical, we want to get that good search engine optimization, as they call it in the biz.
That's always what we're chasing on this podcast.
Exactly. So isopods, going to be next episode. And I also don't have sort of a politics or what the administration's doing on science thing. That's kind of wrapped in toward the tail end of this episode. So with that, we'll roll right into Today in History. What do you got for us, Mike, for April 16th, day after tax day?
Yeah. So, Gavin.
Yeah.
Can you name like famous news guys?
The first one that comes to mind, obviously, is Walter Cronkite.
So in 1962, April 16th, Walter Cronkite began anchoring CBS Evening News. I was hoping that you were going to name him, and you got it right away. Gavin, that's why I love you so much.
How could it, famous news guy, how could it not be Walter Cronkite? I'm pretty sure he stopped before I was able to read. So like, I don't know why I know who he is.
Longer than you think, but let me check that actually. Give me 1 second. Yeah. Walter Cronkite, famous news dude. If you don't know Walter Cronkite, like your dad knows Walter Cronkite.
Right. He was like the news back when there was only like 2 stations to get news from.
Yeah. It says here years active 1935 to 2009. So like,
oh my God.
I don't know when you learned how to read, but
definitely before 2009.
How about that? So yeah, Walter Cronkite began his career on CBS, that is, on Today in 1960, what did I say, 62.
Wow.
Although it appears he was actually broadcasting before then.
For like 30 years before that. That's crazy.
Yeah. Dude died in 2009 at the age of 92. What a life. Legend. What a life he led. Absolutely. All right. So that is my today in history. Do we have anything else, or are we ready to get right into it?
I think we're ready to just get right into it. Give the
Let's do
people
it.
what they're asking for.
Cut the foreplay. Let's go.
Exactly. So, my first bullet point here says science warning. This might be a little bit of a technical episode. We're going to get just a little bit into genetics, which I do not particularly like. A bit into what exactly is a species, something we've talked about on the show a number of times. A bit about ethics in science, and a bit into politics toward the end. I read many an article for this episode because I wanted to make sure I get it right for legal reasons. And like I said, I don't...
Since when do we worry about legal reasons on the show? You let me co-host.
Well, because we're talking particularly about a company today. And
I'm sure they're listening.
Right. A large, for sure multi-million, probably close to $1 billion company. And I don't want to get sued. I'm poor. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I just wanted to make sure that I got everything as right as can be like reasonably expected for a podcast that doesn't have a fact-checking team or make money.
In fact, has still to this day lost money over the course of our run.
We are net negative for cash flow on this podcast.
And have been since the very beginning.
Absolutely. But yeah, so I'll give you as much genetics and science as I think is like digestible. So I'm not going to go like deep into it, but feel free to pause me if there's anything that you want me to explain a little bit further. So, about a week ago, maybe a little more at the time the episode actually comes out. If you spent any time on the paleontology side of social media, you've undoubtedly seen the news about a company called Colossal Biosciences, sort of de-extincting, as they're calling it, the dire wolf. It got a ton of publicity, even in the what I lovingly refer to here in my notes as the normie news, the non-paleontology news. I mean, like a ton. So this was the cover of Time magazine. It had several articles on, each on CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, you name it. Basically, every major news outlet had multiple stories about this happening. And that's unusual. It's not often that something paleontology related that isn't like T-Rex sort of reaches escape velocity and escapes into like the normie side of the news.
Breaks contagion.
Yeah. And so almost immediately, the online paleontology community raised some sort of red flags about this. Because on its face, de-extincting a species is a very bold claim. And a bold scientific claim should be backed up by a large amount of supporting evidence. That's kind of one of the foundations of science. And so, before we get into what exactly this company did, let's do a little bit of background. So first, what is a dire wolf? If you are a Dungeons & Dragons fan, you will know that it's a challenge rating 1 beast. That's basically a slightly stronger wolf. That's roughly the same size as a horse. If you watched Game of Thrones, I did not, but if you've watched that, you'll know that they are large wolves that apparently House Stark, I barely know the names of characters on the show, but House Stark kept them as pets. They were like sort of the symbol of their sort of clan, as I understand it. As adults in the show, they also got roughly the size of like a small horse. The most famous one is named Ghost, which Jon Snow, one of the main characters, it was his direwolf, which is an albino. It was pure white, which is something to keep in mind for a little bit later. The most famous like single direwolf is pure white. The others in the show were not, but however, the real animal, the one that actually existed here in the real world, has the scientific name Aenocyon dirus. It lived all across the Americas, north and south, from the late Pleistocene, about 120,000 years ago, through to only about 10,000 years ago. So Not the longest lived species, but fairly recent, all things considered. There may be one specimen that was found in China, but we're not really sure that it was a dire wolf. Who knows? For now, we'll just say the Americas. And they've been found...
You might be getting to this, but do we know what led to its extinction?
Mostly just habitat loss and food loss. It was around this time that all the large herbivores around North America were going extinct, things like mammoths, ground sloths, and as we'll... I don't remember if I say this specifically in my notes here, but this is probably what it was like specialized in eating, is these large herbivores. And so when they started going extinct, so did this.
Okay, so this was not, as best as we can tell, this was not like an anthropogenic caused
correct
extinction. All
right. But yeah, so they've been found all the way from southern Canada, which, even at the time it went extinct 10,000 years ago, that wasn't like the glacial maximum, but it still would have been considerably colder than even like southern Canada is today. All the way down to places that were very warm even back then, places like Florida, Southern California, Texas, and all the savannas of sort of southern or South America. And they're probably the most famous for the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, where there are literally hundreds to thousands of them that have been pulled out of the tar pits. When I went and visited there a couple of years ago, they have an entire wall that is just skulls. There are over 400 direwolf skulls on display.
Is that creepy or cool?
It was so cool.
Okay.
And so if they have that many on display, there are obviously a ton back in their collections that they use for research. So clearly, Southern California was an area that they flourished in. So these were not just like a cold weather species as they seem to be in Game of Thrones. So for the rest of this episode going forward, we're going to compare direwolves a lot to the modern day gray wolf. The wolf that you see in, most media, run around Yellowstone, in places like Alaska and Canada, recently also Colorado. But so it's also important for understanding gray wolves because of what this company actually did. So modern day gray wolves, Canis lupus, likely the species that we domesticated dogs from, they get roughly, on average, about 3 feet tall at the shoulder, and on average weigh about 90 pounds. So not huge by any means, but not small. But their weight varies pretty widely because they live in an absolutely enormous variety of places. In colder climates like Alaska and Russia, they tend to weigh more and can get, over 120 pounds, sometimes even, very, very rarely over 150 pounds. In warmer parts of their range, like India, which also has gray wolves, or even like Arabia, they only weigh on average about 55 pounds. So pretty variable, but overall ballpark 90 is sort of the average. Based on their portrayal in media, you'd probably guess that dire wolves were quite a bit larger. Plus, it was colder back when they were around, and we as a society have just kind of decided that ancient things were bigger than their modern versions.
And that's not based on any science, that's just for funsies?
It's based on a little science. There's something called Bergman's rule that's when or where it is colder, animals of the same species will be larger than warm weather ones.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why the ones that live in Alaska and Russia are bigger than the ones that live in India, because it's cold there. And so dire wolves are, were generally bigger than the average modern gray wolf, but not by that much. They're nowhere near the size of a horse. For example, adult dire wolves from the La Brea tar pits, and this is where we have the best sample size from, which is why we mostly look at dire wolf studies from this place, because we have thousands of them to look at. It basically found that they are above and below the average of gray wolves found in places like the Yukon, Canada. direwolves tended to have much thicker bones, but weren't much bigger, like lengthwise or height-wise. Their skulls were, notably larger, though. But long story short, at least the population from La Brea, the average for direwolves was about the same as the largest gray wolves we have today.
Okay.
So, and that was like the warm weather population, so the ones that actually lived up by Canada were probably a bit bigger. But in fact, people have done like stress simulations on their bones, and the physics say that they couldn't have weighed more than about 240 pounds, or their skeletons would just kind of break. So that is
we're probably looking at like closer to 200 with like maxes up to 220, 230.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if they even got up to 230.
Okay.
Yeah, just because like you want to have that kind of wiggle room.
Right.
So yeah, like ballpark absolute tops is like low 200s. So a bit bigger than gray wolves, but definitely like not, out of the standard deviation of gray wolves.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so next let's look at their sort of taxonomy. How related are direwolves to other wolves? And so for a long time, direwolves were placed in the same genus as gray wolves, which is the genus Canis. It's the same one that wolves, coyotes, domestic dogs. It has 8 different species in it, depending on exactly how you count them. And the reason why it kind of depends how you count them is because species in this genus and dogs in general hybridize with each other like crazily easily all the time.
And what does that mean?
So, for example, wolves and coyotes are not the same species, but they make hybrid babies constantly. Anywhere that their ranges overlap, they are constantly making babies with each other.
Well, that's fun. Is there any? This might be a very stupid question. When we're talking about making babies and like birds, bees, and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, is there any demonstrated preference for the male to more often be a wolf and the female to be a coyote, or vice versa, or is it does that not make any difference at all?
Not that I'm aware of. I would think it would probably be more likely that the female is a wolf, just for like size reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Coyotes are bigger than you think they are. Like they're not like the size of like a fox,
right.
But they are smaller than wolves. So I would think just like size wise of the baby, I would think it would be more common for the female to be a wolf. But I don't know that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so depending on, as we'll talk about in a little bit here, we've talked about a handful of times on the show, but not recently, that we don't have like a great definition of what a species is, because nature is more complex than the boxes that we make to put it in to make it easier to talk about. And so in different scenarios, we use different things called species concepts. The most common one that you probably learned in, high school biology is called the biological species concept. That one basically says, if 2 species can reproduce and produce viable offspring, then they are the same species. Obviously, that does not work for everything.
That seems wrong. That seems wrong.
It depends. There's a lot of different ways to do it. For example, as a paleontologist, we have no idea how to tell if fossil organisms were reproducing or not with each other. So we can't use the biological species concept. So we use something called the morphological species concept. We'll talk more about that one a little bit later. But depending on, and don't even get me started on plants. Plants are insane. Yeah.
As for any new listeners, Gavin, would you like to just briefly give your thoughts on plants?
Not particularly. They just break all the rules that animals follow.
This has been Plant Corner with Gavin.
Yeah. But yeah, so, but because life is so complex, we need to have these different species concepts to use in different scenarios. whoever eventually comes up with like a single good working species concept is gonna win the Nobel Prize every year for like a decade. Like yeah. And so depending on which species concept you are using, wolves and coyotes may or may not be different species. I don't, there's really no one who does consider them the same species for various reasons, mostly genetic reasons. And a great example of sort of this weird in-between is a species called the red wolf. And so they are likely, so this is a different species, Canis rufus. And this species is likely what is called a genetic admixture of gray wolves and coyotes. That was a new term to me, so I'm going to explain it here. So an admixture is basically when two species hybridize, so in this case, wolves and coyotes, that creates a population that has both wolf and coyote DNA. Then, this population gets sort of isolated for a while from both pure wolves and coyotes. So there is no new wolf and coyote DNA being brought in. It is just this hybrid population being left to its own devices for a while. Then, this population gets unisolated and can remix with pure wolves and coyotes. Because it had been isolated for a while, it is now not really either of them, kind of its own new thing. And so it is genetically distinct from either wolves or coyotes, but can still interbreed with either of them. And so this whole concept of how easily these different, wolf or coyote or dog species interbreed with each other will become important in a second. So hang on to this. Different species of dogs just really like having babies with each other.
As any person who's been to an animal shelter can tell you.
Yes. Well, those are all the same species, but I digress. So from the first time direwolf fossils were described in like the 1850s, all the way until 2021, direwolves were considered a species of Canis. So in the same species, depending on who you ask, they were even in the same genus. Most people considered that. Some people even consider them the same species, just different subspecies as gray wolves. Their skeletons are very similar. However, in 2021, a massive 49 author paper came out in Nature. One of the main biology journals that looked at both the morphology of the bones and also at 5 partial direwolf genomes containing the DNA of these animals, and comparing it to modern dog and wolf species from all over the world. And what they found was that even though the morphologic part of the study, looking at the bones, suggested that they were pretty close to wolves, closely related, none of the various DNA studies suggested that they were close at all.
Really?
Yeah.
So something's off here.
Yeah. And if it was just like one source of DNA, that would be one thing. But they were able to basically use a couple of different methods of ancient DNA, examination. So it was pretty robust. And in fact, the study sort of suggested that gray wolves were more closely related to the jackals of Africa, African painted dogs, and the dhole, which is a small dog from Southeast Asia, than they were to the direwolf. So gray wolves were more closely related to these wolves from all over the world than they were to the direwolf. And they did some sort of genetic clock stuff, and it seems like direwolves diverged from all those other ones, the wolves, the jackals, the dhole, about 6 million years ago. So, like, not that recent. And it showed no genetic mixture at all with gray wolves.
Wow.
And given how much we just talked about, how much different dog species like to hybridize and mix their genetics together, the fact that this had no gray wolf DNA in it at all showed that, okay, yeah, these were not closely related at all. They probably could not have even reproduced, and with viable offspring anyway, with gray wolves.
So something's off here.
Right, and what it seems like is this is just a case of convergent evolution. Why they're so similar.
Really?
Yes. Because they were living in similar habitats, they were living similar lifestyles,
and convergent evolution, correct me if I'm wrong here, but for like the listeners at home, that's when like two different species independently develop a similar trait, and just like, I don't want to quite call it a coincidence because there are reasons for it.
Right.
But like they have nothing to do with one another.
Right. It's usually for similar reasons.
Like for similar reasons, but the two of them, like the one species did not influence the other species.
Right.
They both may have been influenced by similar factors, but
right. They're similar because they do similar things, not because they are closely related.
Yes. Okay. Just want to make sure I had that right and then make sure the listeners knew what was going on.
Right. And so because of all of this, because they were found to not be all that similar, or closely related, and because they, were found to have split off about 6 million years ago, they were given their own genus, Anoscion. So no longer in the same genus as gray wolves, their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the science stood on direwolves 2 weeks ago. Just recapping here, they're a fairly large, but not giant. Like, there were bigger dogs than this, for sure. And not particularly closely related to gray wolves. They lived in all sorts of environments, from, areas that were very cold in southern Canada during the Ice Age, all the way down to the equator in South America. That was 2 weeks ago. Then, this company, Colossal Biosciences, announced that they had brought the dire wolf back from extinction after 10,000 long years. And so, how...
There's be some follow-up questions.
Yeah. How do they say that they did this? So this is from the company's perspective. What did they do? And so when most people think of de-extinction, it's probably something sort of similar to cloning. People have been trying this with woolly mammoths for a long time, where you implant sort of some DNA from a woolly mammoth or a whole genome into like an egg cell. Then you implant that into a female elephant, and the elephant gives birth to a baby mammoth. That has been the main focus of like de-extinction research for most of the time that it has been taken seriously. And that is not what Colossal Biosciences did here. We, at least, they have not published it if they have it, but we do not have a full direwolf genome. We just don't. The caveat there is that they have not, published in a peer-reviewed way that this company, if they do have it. So, with that possible exception where they might, but if they do, they haven't told us. And based on all their PR, I feel like they would have told us if they did.
They wouldn't be shy about it?
No, they would not. They have suggested that they have genetic data that sort of supports the previous thoughts that direwolves were closely related to gray wolves, but they have not published those data yet, so, we really don't know. And so, here's a direct quote from Colossal's chief science officer to CNN. Quote, "We are trying to bring back, we aren't trying to bring back something that's 100% genetically identical to another species. Our goal with de-extinction is always create functional copies of those extinct species. We are focusing on identifying variants that we knew would lead to one of these key traits." Unquote. And so, right from the get-go, they acknowledge, this is not, a genetic clone of a direwolf. They are admitting that right from the beginning. Cool.
Okay, so they're not trying to like, they're not trying to lie to anybody, at least in the fine print.
Right. And so it's also really worth pointing out that the chief science officer of this company was one of the people who was on that 2021 paper.
Mm-hmm.
So like this is, a pretty well respected person. And so they at least 4 years ago signed off on dire wolves not being that closely related to gray wolves. And so what exactly, if they weren't just making a genetic clone, DNA strand for DNA strand of a direwolf, what exactly did they do? They took a gray wolf genome, just modern day gray wolf, and they made a total of 20 edits to a total of 14 genes.
20 edits to 14 genes. Now, this seems like the kind of thing that would be like very small because we have lots of genes, but I imagine you're about to tell me that it's actually more significant than I think it is.
No.
Okay.
So, for context, dogs and wolves do have fewer genes than we do. Not by a ton. They still have, tens of thousands of them. But a lot of them are what is kind of called, probably incorrectly, but called junk DNA, where a lot of it just doesn't appear to be doing a whole lot. And that's the case with most things. Like, we have a ton of that too. But,
right.
So they took 14 genes, and some of them they made 2 edits in, most of them they made 1 edit in. Which that could be just a simple, replacing 1 letter. So DNA is kind of coded in 4 different letters, A, C, T, and G. That could be as simple as, switching one of those letters to a different one. And we understand pretty well what each gene does. We studied dogs a lot. And so they basically made these edits, and then basically from there did a sort of normal cloning thing. They took that genome, injected it into, an egg cell of a dog, implanted that into a surrogate domestic dog, which they bred to be, a larger species of dog, just because one of the tweaks that they made was to make them bigger, because dire wolves, again, were a bit bigger than wolves. And so all of that, those surrogates gave birth to 3 puppies, 2 in October of last year, 2024, and then 1 in January of this year, 2025. So there are 3 of them. And so the technique that they use to change these genes is a really incredible technology called CRISPR.
I'm familiar with CRISPR. When I say I'm familiar, I mean I've heard of it.
Right.
I believe I have friends that have used it.
Yeah.
Are you one of those friends?
I'm not.
I feel like, you remember Casey?
Yeah.
I feel like Casey, I remember hearing Casey was using CRISPR. I might be wrong. I might be completely off base on that. But
I don't know what she's doing these days. But anyway.
Yeah.
Long story short, it is something that we learned because bacteria have been able to sort of add and remove things from their genome for forever. So we've basically taken their ability to do that and basically turned it into like a functional copy paste, or I guess cut paste would probably be better, that we can use for DNA. We can very accurately cut a segment out of DNA and replace it with another one, like very accurately.
Which is wild.
It is insane. And this technology's been around for, readily available and like accurate and working for, probably not quite a decade, but close. And so
that sounds about right.
Yeah. And so, it's not like Colossal Biosciences invented CRISPR, but they did use it in a really interesting way, making some of those edits in the genes more efficiently than anyone else had before, which is really cool. So mostly CRISPR edits are done sort of one at a time, with the DNA sort of still in the cell. And that is pretty invasive. You're basically doing like teeny tiny surgery on the cell. And so that can put a lot of stress on those cells. And so especially if you're editing in multiple places, like on different chromosomes, And here, what Colossal was able to do is make multiple edits at the same time, which is much less invasive and much less stressful on the cell, which is amazing. This was like a truly, big step forward for genetic editing research. So like, I'm not trying to downplay the accomplishments that they're making on like a technical level in this kind of thing. And they also did something interesting with their cloning. Like they got the source cells, because normally when you do cloning, you have to do like stem cell stuff. And those can be kind of hard to isolate from like an adult creature. But they found a way to do it just from like a blood sample, which again, no one that I'd never heard of that anyone else being able to do that before. So this is again another, step in making cloning way easier, way more efficient. So like really not trying to downplay some of the really cool, really interesting technological leaps that this company is doing. However, a lot of that really interesting stuff is quite hard to find beneath all the spin. And we'll get to some of the other cool stuff that they're doing toward the end of the episode. But now let's talk about the spin. This is the part that everyone online, at least that I know, has a problem with.
And this is, I probably should have said this kind of at the beginning when we were talking about this. I had not seen any of this. So Gavin talked about all the different areas of the internet that this has been blowing up. I had seen a headline on a YouTube video that I had not clicked on about a dire wolf, only because I knew and quite liked the creator, who I think you're going to mention a little bit later on.
Yep.
But besides that, like I don't know any of this. So tell me about the spin. Tell me about the kind of like media criticism part of this.
Yeah. So the spin in the media around this thing has been probably the most frustrating part, because, like I said, it was on the cover of Time magazine. That is where they chose to announce this research, because this company has been doing other research. I don't know, maybe you saw this, but they made some like woolly mice using mammoth genes a couple months ago.
Doesn't ring a bell, but I may have seen it.
But it's like, so we knew that they were working on mammoth stuff. We knew that they were working on red wolf stuff, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Nobody knew that they were doing anything with dire wolves. And so instead of doing it in some kind of like science publication, even like a public facing one that's not like a journal, they did it in Time magazine,
which is a pretty like
it's a
general normie kind of
yeah. And so that immediately was my first like, I don't think I like this. That was my first like thought, was like, without any other context, I'm like, this seems just a little off for reasons that I didn't really know why at the time. And so going back to, not from Time, but from CNN, that chief science officer, her name is Dr. Beth Shapiro. Another quote that she gave to CNN, quote, "I recognize that the scientific community is saying, oh, it's not genetically close enough to be a dire wolf. These classifications are human constructs. They are useful frameworks for talking about things, but they're tools, not truths, right? And we successfully identified 20 precise genetic variants. It's not very much, but we did. And in doing that, resurrected these key differences in the way these animals look." Unquote.
That seems like someone that's trying to get a little cute with the words they're using. Like,
yes,
she's trying to play technically correct with things that technically correct with an audience that is not able to really understand what is and is not technically correct.
Right. And they're really, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but they're really leaning into like the fact that we don't have a great definition for a species. And they're kind of weaponizing that and using it against, being like, well, by our definition of species that we are using, we think it's okay to call it a dire wolf. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And so they're also, this company is very active on Reddit. They run the subreddit r/de-extinction. And they've been very active in all sorts of subreddits. And they also said, I tried to find it. I found it at some point, but I tried to find it again when I was writing this outline and I couldn't find it. But they're, according to them, mostly using something called the phenotypic species concept. So we talked about those species concepts a little bit ago. They're using one called the phenotypic species concept to support calling these direwolves. Let's break that down. So, the phenotype is the part of the genome that is expressed, as opposed to the genotype, which is what the DNA literally says. So, for example, my mom has blue eyes. My dad has brown eyes. Because of this, I know that I have one blue eye gene from my mom and one brown eye gene from my dad. That's my genotype. I have one blue eye, one brown eye. That's what the DNA says. I have brown eyes because between those two eye colors, brown is the dominant gene. Having brown eyes is my phenotype.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this can be, any number of things. Like, a phenotype can get expressed in tons of different ways. So, the phenotype can be things like not being able to digest dairy, never growing in your wisdom teeth. Lots of people just never grow them. Having red blood cells that are more efficient at carrying oxygen, like some high elevation populations of people in like the Himalayas have.
Like height and stuff?
Yes, having a genetic disorder that makes you like 8 feet tall. That is your phenotype. Even some kinds of
does it have to be a disorder? Can't it just be like, yes, you are just a completely normal height of 5'5" instead of 5'7"?
That gets a little wonky because a lot of that can also be influenced by like your nutrition growing up.
Okay.
Yeah, I use that as an example of like something that is unavoidable either way.
Sure. Okay.
And so the phenotypic species concept basically says that you can distinguish one species from the next based on differences in that phenotype. And in many cases, this is true. You don't need a DNA test to recognize the differences between a chimpanzee and a gorilla. Or houseflies and mosquitoes. Both of those are, species of flies. We can tell the difference just by some of their features, their phenotype. Flies have, much bigger heads relative to the rest of their body than mosquitoes do. Gorillas are just bigger and have differently shaped heads than chimps, etc.
Mm-hmm.
However, as with every species concept, like we talked about, it has problems. And this species concept falls apart in a lot of edge cases. For example, when two organisms are very similar to one another in many, many ways, but different in very crucial ones. For example, there are many species of birds that look, functionally identical to one another. They're the same size, same plumage color, same diet, same lifestyle, etc. But they do not interbreed with each other because their songs are different.
Their songs?
Yeah, how birds sing to each other?
Really? That's what makes the difference there.
In some species, yeah. That's also true for some frogs as well.
I mean, it's true for some humans if you don't like the right kind of music.
Well, yeah. But it's like, at least humans are all one species. These are different species because they are genetically isolated from one another. They probably could reproduce with one another, but they just don't like each other's sounds, so they don't. In this case, the phenotypic species concept would consider those the same species, but they don't interbreed, so are they? I don't know. Depends who you ask.
Right.
It also kind of falls apart when you consider evolution too much, or if you can't look at the entire phenotype of an organism. So, for example, like I said, phenotype not only is how you look, but also can be a lot of the different chemical things going on inside your body. And a really good example of how evolution can kind of break this is the coelacanth. Very famous fish, sort of the stereotypical living fossil. We knew of this group of fish as fossils before we found them alive in the world today. For like 100 years, we knew about the fossils before we found living ones. And so just looking at the bones, living coelacanths would look functionally identical to the youngest fossil coelacanths. But the fossils are, 66 million years old. And so if you were to base this purely on the phenotypic species concept, at least as I understand it, these fossil coelacanths should be the same species as the modern ones. But no paleontologist will really argue that, because 66 million years is a long time for genetic drift to happen, and almost certainly there were differences between the modern and fossil ones that do not get preserved. Things even like scale color, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is also very, very difficult to sort of make any assertions about the relatedness of two species based on the phenotypic species concept. If you were going purely off of the phenotype of the organisms you're looking at and nothing else, you'd assume that, for example, a husky dog is more closely related to a wolf than it is to a chihuahua. But it's not. And that's a little bit of a bad example because we've just completely messed up dogs so much. But, again, purely based on phenotype, of sort of a more natural example, manatees you would think, purely based on shape and phenotype, would be fairly closely related to things like dolphins. They both live in the water, they both have no back legs, they both have flat tails that they use to swim with. But they are basically on the complete opposite sides of the placental mammal family tree. They are not closely related at all.
Really?
And so again, I've just spent the last few minutes telling you all the ways that this doesn't work. That said, the phenotypic species concept is honestly fairly similar to the morphological species concept that I mentioned earlier that is kind of the core of paleontology. It's really the only species concept that works consistently well within the bounds of like the type of data that we get in paleontology, especially paleontology that, focuses on times older than we're able to get DNA for. And so, those in glass houses ought not throw stones. But, paleontologists recognize that the morphological species concept has holes. And even in fossil organisms, so we try to pair it with other species concepts like, for example, the phylogenetic species concept. And I know I'm throwing a lot of words out, but...
so many words.
Yeah. So the phylogenetic species concept is based on evolutionary lineages. So things are different species, because they have diverged genetically from each other, or their lineages have split at some point in time. So you can sort of combine species concepts to make a more robust model when you're trying to compare the relatedness of different species. And all of that said, I think that calling these animals made by Colossal Biosciences direwolves is just factually inaccurate, or at best misleading. And it's even more complicated when you look at the PR around it. For starters, so much of their PR has been about the appearance of these animals. Because frankly, you can't really talk much about their ecology because they're living in pens, right? Very, very large, very open. They have a lot of space. They're being very well taken care of. But it's like, we can't really talk about much else because they can't do much else. So you can really only talk about their appearance. And so since they want us to talk about the appearance so much, let's do that. Starting with the color. There are 3 of these animals out there. They've only shown us 2. They haven't shown us the youngest one. Both of them are snowy white. I don't think they've put out anything, like I said, about the youngest one born in January. Other than that, she exists. But the 2 that we've seen are like pure snow white. And so we do not have any direwolf fossils, at least to my knowledge, preserved with fur. And purely by just probability, there almost certainly were some dire wolves with snowy white fur like this. However, that definitely wouldn't have been the majority, just like in gray wolves today. They show a huge variety in fur color, depending on where they live. If you were a snowy white wolf living in Southern California, you're not going to be very good at hunting because you'd stick out like a sore thumb. And so you wouldn't be able to pass on your genetics, and that wouldn't be selected for. And so it was just kind of odd that because this is one of the things they changed. This wasn't like the base genetics of the wolf of the DNA that they tweaked from the gray wolf was white. This was something they did on purpose. And it just so happens that the most famous dire wolf in media, Jon Snow's pet from Game of Thrones, was white. What a coincidence.
How about that? Okay.
And they've leaned very, very hard into this in the PR. They had the puppies sit on the Iron Throne for a photo shoot. George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones books, got a picture holding one of them. And I'm sure this is totally unrelated, but both George R.R. Martin and Peter Jackson, who was sort of the showrunner for Game of Thrones, are investors in Colossal Biosciences.
I want to make sure I understand your criticism here of all this, because it sounds like the science here is actually like really cool and interesting and can have a number of practical uses. Your problem is the branding and the way they are kind of indignantly saying, no, yes, we did, when everybody else is trying to pump the brakes on this.
Yes.
Is that about right?
But I have a deeper criticism that we'll talk about in a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, so, like I said, because they have not published the genome that they're working with, the direwolf genome, we have gray wolf genomes, but we don't know if the direwolf genome that they are using was white, or if they're saying it is, but we don't know. And frankly, the fact that the people who make a lot of money off of dire wolves, especially a very popular one being bleach white, are investors in the company that they used a lot in photo shoots and things, that doesn't give me a lot of faith that the genome that they're working with actually was white. It seems to me that there's some capitalism reasons why they made these puppies white. And that also isn't helped by the fact that, so the two that they've been showing off, the older two, they're both boys. They named them Remus and Romulus, which are honestly great names for them. It's based on the founding mythology of Rome. Very good names, A+. But the youngest one that they haven't really shown off, the girl, is named Khaleesi from Game of Thrones.
That's a fun name. Oh, I don't watch Game of Thrones. I wouldn't have gotten that one.
Yeah, that is the name of a character in Game of Thrones.
Okay, so they know what they're doing, it sounds like.
Yeah, so I'm always fairly skeptical of rich people throwing their money around. But man, this sure does seem like some form of conflict of interest, because I'm positive that the Game of Thrones people are going to make money off of this, and not just from a return on investment standpoint in the company. If the scientists felt some kind of pressure to make these animals white when they otherwise shouldn't have been, that is ethically really sketchy to me. I don't like that at all. And this, if anyone is familiar, and if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are. This is giving me vibes of the more teeth argument in Jurassic World, where it's like they, changed one of the dinosaurs to look more aggressive, to look bigger and stronger and scarier, because it would sell more tickets. And that is the same vibe that I'm kind of getting from here. Like I said, I could be wrong, and I'm, perfectly open to that. But this just seems ethically really gray to me, and I don't like it. Yeah, because of this focus on the aesthetics of these animals, that just kind of inherently makes me skeptical in a lot of their other claims, which is a bummer, because like I said, some of the things that they're doing genetically are really cool. And so, for example, they say several times in both the article in Time magazine and in a promotional video that they made that gray wolves are the closest living relatives to dire wolves. As we've talked about, that's not true. Based on the current understanding from that 2021 paper, dire wolves should be equally related to gray wolves, red wolves, domestic dogs, coyotes, African painted dogs, jackals, etc. They're equally related. And they're even would have, it's the same idea as like having 10 first cousins, you know? If you're all first cousins, you are equally related to all of them.
Right.
And Colossal should really know that because their chief science officer was an author on the paper that told us that. But she has been out there saying that they're the closest living relative, which is just not true. They could, in that paper that they are apparently publishing at some point, say that and present evidence for that, but they haven't done that. And aside from that, there are perfectly good reasons to have used gray wolves for the fact that they are the largest, canids around today. So, like, there were other good reasons to say we use them because they're big. But it's like they're trying to convince us of something to make it seem a little more kosher than it is. And so this is just something that they are, as of our current understanding of the science, factually incorrect about.
Awesome.
Yeah. Also, in the Time article, it says, quote, they identified 20 differences in 14 genes that account to the direwolf's distinguishing characteristics, including its greater size, white coat, wider head, larger teeth, unquote. And then they go on to list a couple of other things. But as we've discussed, we really don't know what color direwolves were.
Is that common?
What do you mean?
Like us not knowing what color?
Yes.
Or like basic, I guess color is the one thing I'm thinking of different animals, way back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very hard to know what color things are if you don't have their fur or scales or skin. For example, saber-toothed cats. To my knowledge, we have never had one preserved with fur. We have no idea. Technically, we don't even know that they had fur. But that's just an assumption that we make because they're a mammal. And all other cats have fur. So these are things that you just kind of like make good faith assumptions about. But this is not a good faith assumption. And so, as we talked about, we don't know what color they were. And they likely had a large variety of coat patterns, just like gray wolves do today. And the fact that they call being white a distinguishing characteristic is just wrong. It's, as much of a distinguishing characteristic as having red hair is to humans. In parts of the world, that probably is characteristic, but almost certainly not universal. And a lot of their PR, especially the content that they themselves are producing, not the interviews in Time, but some of their own promotional videos, have been focused on ecology, trying to sort of refill the gaps that were left when dire wolves went extinct. And for a few reasons, this is not a good argument. Number one, there is no universe in which we release these things out into the wild. That is never going to happen. For a number of reasons. One, they are genetically modified creatures. They're GMO creatures. As much as GMOs can genuinely be an excellent thing for the world, people don't like them, mostly because they don't understand them, and especially in things like food. But people have been trying to reintroduce just regular gray wolves across North America for decades. And in Colorado, they're actually doing it. And from what I can tell, that's actually going fairly well. But ranchers and other agricultural groups fought that tooth and nail to prevent, like I said, just regular wolves from being reintroduced. How are people going to feel about releasing what, up to this point, the media has been hyping up as genetically modified superwolves into the wild. That is just not going to happen. Especially not in the US anyway. Secondly, even if they were introduced into the wild, the world that direwolves lived in is gone. It just does not exist anymore. Climate change, even anthropogenic climate change aside, the global climate is just warmer than it was when they were around. As we sort of talked about a little bit earlier, it's hypothesized that, one of the reasons they became extinct in the first place was that they were specialized to eat all the generally larger animals that were around in the Ice Age, like mammoths, horses. There were bison that were like 50% larger than modern bison, which were already huge. And so, like today, if we were to just release these out into the wilderness, the largest animal in North America for them to readily eat are like deer. Like, we just don't have large herbivores in a ton of parts of the US anymore. And, they would just have no food. Even the bison that are quote unquote wild are so restricted that they're, bison are functionally extinct in ecosystems all across North America. There's only like...
So is this just like, even if we take away all like the media hype, is this just like a proof of concept thing? Is this people wanting to make money, and this is like a flashy way to make money? Like, I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the scientific value here, or is there none?
There is. There genuinely is. And I think that's the part. If this was purely a grift to, make money for making money's sake, I would be like, it's the 2020s. Everybody's grifting, whatever. But the fact that there is some cool science here, not just the genetics, but some actual like ecology stuff that we're going to talk about in a little bit, that is really cool. That really should be the focus. But the capitalism is kind of getting in the way. In a way that Hank Green puts very well in something I'm going to read, basically to close us off in a little bit.
All right.
And lastly, why talking about the ecology of these things is not really the argument they think it is that they kind of ignored the fact. So we talked a bunch about different species concepts earlier. There is an entire species concept that is built around a creature's function in its ecosystem, called the ecological species concept. And basically, this species concept throws away all of the taxonomy. How related different creatures are to each other, that's out the window. Who cares? This only focuses on the niche that something fills in the ecosystem. Basically, if something goes extinct, you could replace it with something totally unrelated, but that does a similar job. Deer go extinct in your ecosystem, replace them with kangaroos. Oh, great. If wolves go extinct, replace them with hyenas. Great. And this is basically what they're advocating for here, without using those words. In one of their promo videos, they refer to ecosystems sort of like a tower of Jenga blocks, which is, a decent analogy.
Sure.
So, if you remove too many blocks, or if you remove one that's like really holding a lot of the weight, the tower or ecosystem, collapses. But if you can slide a block, a new block, that is the same, shape in the ecosystem, into that now empty spot, when a species goes extinct, you might be able to save the tower. And what they're saying is that these modified wolves should be slotted into the Jenga tower to replace the actual animal direwolves that are extinct. And, there has been a bit of success at doing this kind of thing. We don't really like introducing species into environments that they're not native to. That's generally seen as bad. But, for example, in Hawaii, we had a whole conversation about this way back in episode 7. Way back. About, there's an area in Hawaii where this, Hawaii has a lot of invasive species, also not just from, trade and things, hitchhiking on ships, but also from the pet trade. Hawaii used to have a species of large flightless goose that was one of the main herbivores on the islands. They went extinct shortly after the very first humans got there because we like to eat large flightless birds. And some people have had success at using large tortoises that were brought to Hawaii as part of the pet trade, but they often get too big for people, so they get abandoned. So this person sort of rescued some and then just kind of let them roam free, like fenced in, so like in a controlled way on their fairly large property. And in places where these tortoises are allowed to just sort of be, roaming, they've seen better growth of native plants. They've seen less growth of invasive plants because they're filling in this role in the ecosystem. And so there are scenarios where things like this do make sense. But in the case of these wolves, the Jenga tower is gone. The Jenga tower has already fallen. It fell 10,000 years ago. So there's no slot for these things to be slot into. It's just gone. And so, starting to wrap up here. So I've said my opinion that these are not the species Anocyon dirus, the direwolf. And I don't really think any paleontologist not working for this company would say so either. But is it okay to actually call them direwolves then? Because obviously lay people use different vernacular than scientists do.
Right.
People use different common names for different animals all the time. People 99% of the time don't know the scientific name of any particular animal they're looking at, nor should they. And so what Colossal is basically arguing is that if it looks like a direwolf and acts like a direwolf, then it's a direwolf. And, I don't really know how to argue against that, to be honest. But they sort of justify it by saying, nature doesn't conform to the boxes we try to put it in to make our brains understand it better, right? Nature is more complex than we can account for with, taxonomy, phylogenetics, and even, the delineation from one species to the next, at the end of the day, is arbitrary. And we've talked about that on this show before.
Right.
We draw these distinctions. Yeah, go ahead.
There is some truth to these distinctions are made up part of it. It sounds like it's being weaponized here, but there is some truth to that in its core.
Yeah, absolutely. And we draw these distinctions because it makes it easier for us to talk about them and study them, because we need language, we need words to be able to talk about things and for everybody to be on the same page of what we're talking about. But these distinctions aren't always representative of nature. And that, like I said, that is true. That's why we have so many darn species concepts, because nature is too complex for a single one of them to be universally applicable. So they say if it looks and acts like a direwolf, then it's a direwolf. And to that I say, yeah, but what they're doing isn't nature, obviously. They took a phrase, direwolf, that existed beforehand, which has a specific definition, and are sort of co-opting its name recognition to sell stocks, is really my opinion on it. And so it's like they took a Ford Ranger truck, installed some seats in the back, and put a bed cap on, and started calling it a Honda Odyssey minivan. So no, I don't think that it is right to call these direwolves in good faith, personally.
Do you think that people are acting in bad faith, or do you think they have a different definition of either good faith or species or what they're doing? Are the people here good faith actors? I think I know your answer.
I think that's really hard to say. You can't know anybody's motivations at the end of the day.
Right.
But I think if you had an off-the-record conversation over a couple of beers with some of the geneticists and people, at a bar or something where no one's going to hear them, I think they also would agree that these it's not right to call these direwolves for anything other than capitalism reasons. Obviously, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but that's...
Do you think that I imagine you think the scientific community is probably with you on that one?
I think so.
Yeah.
And here's the part, so you mentioned earlier, or you asked earlier a bit about, how is this applicable? What is this, all of this even for? What they're doing?
Right.
And I think the thing that bothers me the most is that it obscures some of the really genuinely cool future applications of this. Sorry, that was my dog barking at one of my cats. And I also think this is where a lot of the research sort of initially came from, was some of this things that are genuinely cool applications and important applications. Let's talk about those a little bit. And so, as basically a footnote, it was only like the last paragraph or so in both the CNN and Time articles. They talk about Colossal's work with red wolves, which are a critically endangered species native to the eastern U.S. We talked about those. That was sort of the admixture species I used. So it is a species of wolf. And they had a major genetic bottleneck over the years because we kill wolves. And so their genetic diversity is very low. And Colossal has been working for a while to change that. Previously, for other species that have had genetic bottlenecks like this, we've basically had to just do extremely controlled selective breeding in places like zoos to make sure that the genetics get evenly spread out throughout the population. And occasionally, cloning more individuals to make inbreeding less of a risk. This comes, obviously, with a lot of potential room for error. Like sometimes two red wolves that have compatible genetics that you want to breed, they might just not like each other. And they won't breed.
Right.
Or sometimes, just due to random chance, they might have a litter that is all boys, when the population really needed some more girls.
And that's just the way it goes.
Right. But with the advancements that Colossal has made, they can now just artificially increase genetic diversity by editing these genes, mostly removing some of those potential issues, which is mind-blowingly incredible. This could be a truly, truly amazing thing for conservation efforts around the world, for thousands of species. And they're also apparently putting a lot of money and effort into making literal test tube babies out of these animals, so we wouldn't even need surrogate mothers anymore.
Really?
Yeah.
That's kind of insane.
Yeah, that would be massive in just increasing how many individuals could be added to an endangered species' population. And, the first thing my mind went to was potentially even making it so human women didn't need to carry babies themselves. That is obviously many years down the line and gets into some very morally weird questions, but that's just the first place my brain went to when I read that they were working on that. Because obviously pregnancy is very hard on a lot of people, especially in a lot of places around the world where healthcare, as much as I complain about my own healthcare situation in the U.S., in a lot of places where the female mortality or the maternal mortality rate is really high, if people could have babies without having to be pregnant, that would save so many lives. And, not just, that this is on top of, the things we talked about earlier, the doing CRISPR in less invasive ways, being able to source the initial cell lines from blood instead of, different types of stem cells. These are all genuinely incredible advancements. And so that was initially the last point I had in this outline. But then, of course, because it is the year of our Lord 2025, government officials...
We've got the really good news coming up now.
Yeah. Government officials from the Trump administration weighed in and made things probably worse. So, Secretary of the Interior, billionaire investment guy, and former North Dakota governor, Doug Burgum, posted about the direwolf news in a very annoying way. So
What don't you say?
for anybody not familiar, the Department of the Interior is a really interesting agency because it doesn't really get as much attention as like the Department of Defense, Department of State. But the agency controls like a fifth of U.S. land area. And so they have a lot to do with conservation work and the environment. And so the fact that the Interior Secretary weighed in on major conservation news isn't all that surprising. However, it's what he said in conjunction with a lot of things that the Department of Interior is doing currently around conservation that's kind of the problem. And so the agency, more or less, is trying to change some of the definitions to within the Endangered Species Act to change what qualifies as harming an endangered species, among other like subtle changes like that. Basically making it easier to damage the habitat and things of endangered species. And so in a tweet, Secretary Burgum celebrated Colossal's achievements while fully taking the direwolf stuff at face value. And so many people in conservation took some of his words combined with these changes that Interior is making internally to basically say, why should we protect endangered species when we can just bring them back from extinction now?
So I can see how someone that didn't know what they were talking about might think that, but
obviously it's not true. But if you, again, just took things completely at face value, I get how you could get there. And so while the advancements that Colossal has made can and will be very useful to helping conservation efforts, they're not a silver bullet. We still need the government to be on board and funding conservation efforts and enforcing conservation laws to make advancements from Colossal actually mean anything. And so now, in closing, I think Hank Green put it very well in a video he made about this. The link for that video will be down in the show notes. So, quote, "There's not nothing here. It's just hard to celebrate science when you're constrained by the truth in ways these people aren't." Obviously, everyone in this video was told that they have to say dire wolves are back. And of course, I feel like a stick in the mud. I feel that part of my job is popularizing science, but a bigger part of my job is saying true things. And so I can't sit here and tell you that dire wolves have been de-extincted, when in reality, there are a few gray wolves that have been genetically modified to more closely resemble dire wolves. In a thoughtful way, but that's not a dire wolf. So right. I think it's really cool, but I also think that it's an example of the trouble you get into when you want science to be privately funded, where you have to be doing things that excite billionaires. And so you end up in a situation where, like, maybe there was a better candidate for all of these things, but they also have to have a candidate that's splashy, that makes headlines, and that Peter Jackson can cuddle with a direwolf. And that creates incentives to do weird stuff, like saying that they have a paper that indicates gray wolves are the closest relative of direwolves, when that's not the current established understanding of the taxonomy here. But maybe it would be, but the paper didn't come out in time. So why isn't the paper out? If the paper exists, why can't we see it? Usually, you wouldn't talk about the results from a paper a bunch on a subreddit before the paper gets published." Unquote. And he goes on to talk a bit, more about the incentives of a business don't always align with what makes good science. Which is why funding science with public money, while sometimes wasteful, science isn't, always a particularly efficient process, but why it's a good thing for society. So, yeah. TLDR.
As always, Hank Green puts it very well.
Yes. But yeah, direwolves are not back. It's mostly a PR that's appealing to the investor class and obscuring some actually really amazing science. And unfortunately, it's going to be co-opted to probably be a net harm to conservation efforts, depending on the next handful of years go.
I mean, that is, the part where it is cool science is the part that I want to, harp on again. This is miraculous stuff. that we're talking about here being put into ways in all sorts of cool ways. And imagine, assuming that everything here, happened, at least the science, happened as we're told, like, what could be done in 5 to 10 to 20, like all of that. And yet the branding of trying to appeal to the people that are going to give you more money is, that's a disappointing way to go about all of this. And I think it's going to be a disappointing way for us to end this podcast unless you have more you wanted to get to.
No, that's pretty much it. Like I said, just I was talking about this with somebody the other day. I wish that we could live in a society that funded science for science's sake. Or even just, not even necessarily public money, but like private money, just rich people who are like, that guy's doing a cool thing, I'm going to throw him some money. There are people on the earth that have more money than God. And instead of sharing their success, they are doing a lot of work to take any bit of success away from the rest of us. Anyway, this is me just now ranting because I'm tired and it's late.
Well, we're going to go ahead and end the podcast then. And this has been episode 157. If I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That was Gavin. The dire wolf was not featured in any part of this podcast. Hopefully Fia will be back next week, though. Until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.